Thank you very much, everyone. So we're waiting for a few more people, but I think we'll get started and they'll join as they come in. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the second Pink, Auld and Brown book club that we run with the Groucho. My name is Shireen. I am one of the founders of said book club. And tonight is going to take us behind the scenes of crime writing with Alex Walters. Thank you for joining us. And behind the scenes of publishing with Louise Cullen. Today also gives you the opportunity to ask any burning questions you have about being published or indeed about writing. So have your questions ready to ask as we go through the session. A little bit of housekeeping. The chat will last until about 7 o'clock. And at that point, we're going to open up questions to the room. If you could message your question directly to me, I will then put the question out to the group just to avoid everyone talking over each other and making sure that Louise and Alex can hear the questions as they come in. One quick thing we wanted to let you know. So Canelo, I think I'm saying that right, Louise?
Yes, you are.
Just checking. Is one of Europe's fastest growing publishing companies, and they've just announced its first imprint, Canelo Crime. Louise Cullen is the publishing director behind it all. And Louise, before I hand over to you, I just wanted to remind everybody that Small Mercies is currently available as an ebook, but is out in paperback from tomorrow. So if you're begging for the physical book to put on your bookshelf, make sure you go out tomorrow and pick it up. And I think that's enough chat from me. And I think Louise, over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you for reminding us the book's out tomorrow. There's been a lot of preparation and yeah, I'm definitely relieved that it's publication day tomorrow. I'm really looking forward to talking with Alex more about his work, but just to give a little bit of background, more background about myself and the launch of Canelo Crime. I am, as Shireen says, the publishing director at Canelo. I've worked at the company for 4 years, and the company was founded approximately 5 years ago. We publish a wide range of commercial genre fiction. I exclusively focus on crime in light of our new imprint launch and work with some fantastic authors as a result. This is our second, Alex and I are on our second book so far. We have released Small Mercies and have been working away on the follow-up novel Lost Hours, which I won't reveal too much about, as I'm aware. Been reminded that some people may not have read, and we don't want any spoilers in there. He is an author who has published many books, though, even though we have only worked on 2 so far. I believe we're at book, this is the, I think Lost Hours is the 16th, Alex, is that correct? Yeah, I keep having to check that because it just seems to be such a big number. But yes, in the crime fiction genre, and I can offer, I'm sure, a lot of insight into his experiences of being published and the shape of his career as things have changed with publishers in general. Just to go back a little about the Canelo Crime and the launch of this imprint, I think that when you work in the publishing industry, terms like imprint just have an inherent meaning that you all understand, but I'm often reminded by others who don't work in publishing that the concept of launching things like an imprint is a little bit lost on some people who enjoy books just as a reader. And just to touch on why that would be beneficial for us, and not just for publishers but also for readers, for booksellers. An imprint is basically a way to indicate an area of interest and specialism and expertise, and what we hope is by signalling our commitment and passion for crime fiction, we will help booksellers and readers to identify our brilliant authors. There are many books that are published every year, and booksellers do a wonderful job of getting to know their readers and the people who seek out their advice, and it's just really great for a publisher to be able to explain to them, this is what we're all about, and this is why readers who enjoy crime fiction will want to look out for our books. The launch list is 8 titles, of which Small Mercies is one, and most of them are what we would call the police procedural genre. So they feature detectives, which is great news for me because that's probably my favourite form of entertainment, is to watch a crime be solved by a brilliant detective on TV or to read about it in a book. I always find it fascinating and exciting, and live vicariously through the quick-witted detectives who manage to put the pieces together, usually in time to save at least some lives, if not all of them. And so yes, that's a real passion of mine as a reader as well as in my work, and hence the delight that I have of now working on an imprint dedicated to the genre. So I won't go on any more about the background to Canelo, but just to say that it's brilliant to be invited to talk to the Groucho Club members this evening at the book club. We as a publisher have found that even though there have definitely been challenges that the pandemic's presented, including changes to our sales plans and the pattern of our sales and the places they've occurred, we are fortunate that ebooks sustained very well at a time when people couldn't necessarily go out to the shops, and our paperback plans have now kicked back into gear, and we're getting great support on that. But it's been really wonderful to have opportunity to speak to such a wide range of people all over the country or all over the world indeed during the pandemic through things like Zoom, and just to be able to connect with people who share the same love of books that we do. So yes, I'm sure there may be questions about that later. I'd be happy to talk about, but for now I'm going to focus on the far more interesting participant this evening and introduce Alex to talk more about his work. So I think it would be a great place to start, Alex, is just to, obviously we've just said that you're working on a new series for Canelo Crime, but if you could tell us a little about how you first became published, and just a brief overview of your writing career to now, if that's possible, at 16 books. I don't know how
yeah, I think it's 16 now, something like that. I've written, I mean, just to sort of talk about the books I've written very briefly, I've written a number of different crime series. I mean, all my books are crime novels of one sort or another. And they vary a little in terms of the style of them, although I suppose the majority would fall into sort of police procedural as a broad genre. But I mean, the first series I wrote was a series set in Mongolia, would you believe, modern day Mongolia. 3 books in that series, which were published by Quercus, and it's about 15 years ago now, which is a rather slightly scary thought. So I've sort of produced a book a year on average since then. So that was the first series, a series of 3 books, essentially a sort of thriller cum police procedural set in modern day Mongolia. I've then written another series set in Manchester and sort of Greater Manchester, which is where I used to live. That was a series featuring an undercover, female undercover officer called Marie Donovan, who was part of the National Crime Agency. And then I've got another series which is set in the Scottish Highlands, which is where I now live, which is set in and around sort of Inverness and the Black Isle and so on. And then most recently with Canelo, a new series which is set in the Peak District. And my link with the Peak District is basically it's where I sort of was born and grew up, and actually spent most of my adult life on either in or around the Peak District until we moved up to even wilder climes up here. So that's a sort of summary of the career. In terms of how I got started, I've kind of always written, and I always, I've had a number of kind of abortive novels on the go over the years. What actually happened, the way I got published in the end, was I got a novel which was a sort of comic crime novel, really. It was quite different from anything I've written since then. I've been sort of touting that round in a sort of slightly half-hearted way to various agents and publishers and so on. And I sent it to a chap who's now my agent, Peter Buckman, who I think gave me the best advice I've ever had as a writer, really, at that stage. In that Peter's a lovely guy, and he's very, very incisive. And I think he sort of came back basically and said, I really enjoyed reading it. You can clearly write, but I couldn't sell it in a million years. So that told me 2 things. One, I could write and it was worth continuing and worth trying to get something published. And secondly, it probably wasn't worth putting much more effort into the book I had in front of me. But Peter said, if you've got anything else you're working on, let me know. And I'd just begun writing the first Mongolian book because I've been spending some time in Mongolia, and it just struck me as being a brilliant place to set a crime series. So I sent him a little sample of what I'd written of that, and he really liked that. Picked it up. He sort of became my agent at that point. And at that stage, you think, oh, this is it's all going to be downhill, uphill from here. It's going to be wonderful. And as as ever with these things, it takes a lot longer to actually get published than you might expect. The book got picked up, I think, initially by Faber and Faber, who were very keen on it, and then ultimately decided no, they weren't going to. and this is where the sort of element of luck always comes in, I think. The chap who was the commissioning editor at Faber was a close friend of the chap called Anthony Cheetham, who's very much a sort of publishing eminence grise, I suppose is perhaps the word for it these days. But he founded a number of imprints, including Orion and Quercus, and Head of Zeus, I think was his.
Yes.
He was just in the process of setting up Quercus at the time. And I think actually I was probably about the first or second author they signed. And he really liked the book, picked it up, and really went forward from there.
It feels like such a change, I think, just to hear those names mentioned as well now, I think, Alex, because as somebody working in publishing, you realise just how companies and the industry has just evolved and changed, and it does almost feel like a different time, even though it's not actually that long ago at all. There's a couple of things I was really keen to just expand on there as well, because I know that obviously your writing career is so fascinating, what we're here to talk about mainly this evening, but it's definitely worth mentioning that you have other work that you do, largely consultancy work as well, which has brought you into contact with other areas of crime, and it would be great just to hear a little bit about how helpful that is, and does that inspire your work and give you any insight that you can bring into your writing?
I mean, it very much does. I mean, it's a sort of interesting, my background, strangely, is a sort of human resources background. That's where I sort of started off my career many years ago. I sort of worked as a consultant. I've worked essentially what the sort of consultancy work I've done is around areas of kind of job design and how to sort of create jobs and organisation structures and so on. And sort of, but I think initially, really by coincidence, I ended up working largely in the sort of criminal justice sector. It's just one of those things where you do one job and that leads to another job, and at least you get recommended by other people and so on and so forth. So I ended up worked in a lot of police forces. I worked for the prison service to a extent. I'm still at the moment doing some work with the prison service. I worked with the National Crime Agency, and I worked with areas like probation as well at various points. So the combination of all those things means that, and because what I do really, a lot of it is actually sitting down with people and talking to them in great depth and detail about what the work they carry out and the way they do it and how the job actually operates in practice and so on. What that means is that obviously I'm being paid to do some quite useful research as well in terms of writing the books. And although
I think
I'm always very careful not to sort of use anything that would be
too much true to life detail.
But it does give me enormously useful background. And the whole of the series I wrote based on the National Crime Agency was just really came out of just like complete fascination with some of the work they were doing and how that work was carried out and so on.
I think that it's really it's something that crime fiction fans respond to a lot, is they have a brilliant eye for detail so often, and it's really important to that readership that you do deliver on the authenticity front, and plausibility is definitely an important factor, I think, when we're looking at the books that we work upon. I was going to ask you a little more specifically now about the Annie Delamere series, which is the one that we've been obviously working on mainly at Canelo, because I think there's fascinating subjects to touch on there, just to perhaps give a little bit of insight in case people aren't aware. So Small Mercies is the first book in the series, as we've mentioned, and it has a fantastic opening scene which still gives me a chill, in which our lead character, DI Annie Delamere, is out walking on the Peak District on her day off with a colleague who's a friend, and two sort of burly motorbike riders are up ahead of them on the moors, and she hears a commotion and goes to look at what's going on, and these two men sort of say, "You don't want to look at this, you women won't thank us for showing you what's behind this hedge." And obviously she flashes her police card and says, "I'm DI Annie Delamere," and it's a gruesomely mutilated body that she finds, and that kicks off a whole chain of events that cause her to investigate some quite disturbed occurrences taking place in the Peak District. And Annie is a really fascinating character who I would like to talk about, but I just wanted to ask you, Alex, how this is different to your previous books, because as you've said, you have worked on crime fiction series and police procedural series before. I just wondered what you felt was different about this.
I think there were several things. I mean, I think first of all, it was enjoyable to write about a female lead character, although I mean, the Marie Donovan series had a lead character, a female lead character, but that was slightly different in the sense that she was an undercover officer, so wasn't operating in a sort of conventional police environment, as it were. So, and I've got in other series, I've got some fairly major characters who are female, but this is the first time I've really written a book about a female lead who's also a police detective, as it were. So that was quite interesting and enjoyable. I think I was keen to write about the Peak District as well, because I just thought it was an area where you had this wonderful mix of things. So you've got, you know, little chocolate box sort of villages, you've got the spectacular landscapes, but you've also got, you know, things like ex-pit villages in and around those areas. You've got you know, sort of urban landscapes in Derby and in Sheffield and in Chesterfield and so on. So there's a nice mix of things to write about there. And I suppose one of the differences in a way with this series from other series I've written is that it's, I'm not sure political is quite the right word, but it's got to focus on kind of social issues, perhaps in a way that is not the case with some of the other series I've written. So, for example, in Small Mercies, there's a lot in there about sort of far right politics and conspiracy theories and all of those sort of things that have become very, very sort of topical at the moment. And in the second book, there's sort of issues around sort of gig economy and zero hours contracts and all those kinds of things that are sort of part of the picture as well. So for me, I think it's partly, it was quite nice to have an opportunity to explore some of those issues. And in fact, Annie Delamure's partner is a Labour MP based in a sort of, you know, Derbyshire constituency, a fictional Derbyshire constituency called Sheena Pearson. And that again was just sort of interesting to write something that was a bit different in terms of that sort of political context and so on.
I do think that really does add quite a lot, and it just actually highlights as well the importance of setting. We've obviously said that the level of detail and authenticity can be really crucial for enjoyment, but I do think that setting is such a big part of why we respond to books, whether that be that you know the setting and it's familiar, or it's somewhere that you've never been but you've got an opinion of. But I certainly would say that despite being from sort of the north originally myself, I don't know the Peak District that well, and it's been fascinating for me to learn more about how people that can live almost, you know, cheek by jowl can have such different circumstances and lives, and people may see these places as lovely tourist locations that they enjoy visiting, but actually when you live there, your experiences can be significantly different. So I think that comes through really well in the books, and it does, yes, I'd say that's something that is thematically, you know, I can see that that's occurred in Lost Hours as well, and it's really enjoyable to explore. I wanted to ask you, Alex, if you could just tell us a little about how you approach your writing. I always think it's really interesting to learn about how authors do this. So do you plan and outline? Do you get stuck in? Do you have ideas that you live with for a long time and then eventually put down on paper, or do they just occur to you and you have to write the whole thing in the middle of the night? How does that go?
I'm certainly not a rigorous planner by any means. I'm very much somebody who sort of, I suppose I tend to have an idea, or very often actually what I start with is a scene. You know, I sort of have an image of a particular location or particular scene, and the opening scene of Small Mercies is, you know, I mean, that the area where that scene opens is an area that I used to go walking fairly regularly. A place called Beeley Moor, which is just up above sort of Chatsworth in Derbyshire. Just outside Chesterfield, and it's a very creepy place. I mean, it's an area that's full of sort of prehistoric burial cairns and such like. So it's a spectacular place in terms of as a location, but it's also a very sort of eerie place to kind of walk in. And I thought, and it's particularly, you know, oddly, it's almost more eerie on a nice bright sunny day than it is on a sort of dark, miserable day, as it were. So I thought that, you know, that was a scene that came to me, and I wanted to do something with that. And so very often that's the sort of starting point, is starting with a scene and then kind of working from that. And also I think very often what I do is to sort of start with a number of different characters, a number of different settings, and then kind of think, how do these fit together? You know, how do these different apparently disparate stories kind of link together and come together in some sort of coherent sort of whole? So that's very often the way I work. I've tried in the past to sort of do, you know, to write very detailed plans for books, and I find the problem is that, you know, within a chapter or two, I've kind of gone off in some completely different direction anyway, and the story's taken on a life of its own. And I think increasingly, I just feel I'd rather find out what the story is by telling it, rather than sort of trying to plot it and dance.
I think that's really interesting to get insight into that, because as I'm sure you know, as somebody who's been surrounded by writers for much of your career, it's such a there are very disparate views on that, and some people couldn't imagine sitting down to write without having every detail ironed out. But I admire people who can sit down and write at all, whatever approach they take. And would you say that, I think again, just as an insight into the life of a writer, how many hours a day do you write, and how long would you say it takes you to write a first draft? Do you have an idea on that?
It does vary. I mean, I tend to write every day, so I tend to try to write something every day, as it were, including, you know, weekends and so on. So I don't very often take a day off. I mean, there'll be periods between books where I'll just stop for a bit just to get a breather, as it were, but not for very long usually, you know. So I suppose I try to, you know, generally do work most of the day on it in practice. So I'll keep sort of something approaching office hours, as it were, in terms of the way I work. But the way I tend to work is in bursts. So I tend to sort of sit at my desk, as I'm doing now, and I'll be sitting, you know, what to the untutored eye might look like just messing about on the internet, or
research.
But in reality, that's part of the process. And I genuinely think it is. You know, I think it's, you know, I'll spend an hour or so not doing anything, you know, just sort of, and then it'll suddenly start to work, and I'll start to write, and you know, then I'll write, you know, perhaps 500 words, and then there'll be another break, and so on and so forth. And I usually find that towards the end of the day, once it gets to about sort of 3 o'clock or something, that's when it really starts to work for me. So very often I'll do the bulk of what I write, you know, very often within 3 or 4 hours from that sort of point, you know.
And how about if you hit a wall? So if there's a plot point or a character that's just not clicking for you, what would your advice be on that? Would you rethink the whole thing and try and work around the problem that way, or would you just persevere with it? And likewise with characters, do you dismiss them and get rid if they're not working out for you, or do you try and warm yourself to them?
Sometimes with characters I will do, you know. Sometimes I'll decide a character just either is not working, or is not adding anything, or is not. And very often I find with characters that the characters who start off as a minor character become a major character, as it were, you know. So some of these, and there's almost this sort of weird psychology going on there, I think sometimes your sort of subconscious knows more than you do about where the story is going, you know. So sometimes you introduce, and you think, why have I introduced that character? I'm not sure what part they're going to play, and then you find, you know, that eventually they're actually playing quite a big part. So there's that sort of thing happens. I don't very often go back and fundamentally rework what I've written, because I generally find that if I hit a problem in terms of the plot, if I take a bit of time out, then usually something will come together. And I'm surprised very often how that, you know, there'll be a point where I think this is, in fact, my wife always says to me, you know, you always get to a point about, you know, sort of 60,000 words or thereabouts, you know, where you'll be saying, this is never going to work, I'm never going to make this, and then, you know, it somehow does, you know, some inspiration comes from somewhere. And
I think that's probably,
oh yes, that's how it works. Yeah.
It's probably really reassuring for people who are battling with their own manuscripts and their first drafts, and to know that writers who have managed to accomplish a lot have still experienced those same wrangles, but you persevere and plow on, and you do overcome them. I was just going to ask as well, Alex, more about the approach that you take. You've already, I think, given some insight into this, but I think touched on sort of setting, and we've talked a little about Annie's character, and you've talked a little bit about how you approach the plots versus the letting the novels fall out. But as you do write, how much importance would you place on the character or on the crime itself, or would it be something else entirely? So would you say that it's most vital that you can come up with a crime that's going to keep people scratching their heads and really engaged, or would you say that the character is what pulls the story along?
I think for me it's the characters more than, I mean, the two, sorry about the two are interchangeable, but, or, you know, you can't sort of distinguish between them, but I think for me it's more the characters that drive the story rather than you know, a sort of clever plot, as it were. I hope that, you know, the plots come from the characters rather than the other way around, I think, very often. And I think that's one reason why I find it difficult to plot sort of in advance, as it were, because for me, it's not until I start to get to know the characters and how the characters fit together that then the interaction starts to generate the story, as it were, and starts to generate the plot. So, and I think the two things then become sort of, you know, mutually supportive, as it were. That as you get to know the characters, you get to know the plot, and as the plot develops, that starts to reveal things about the characters, and for me, it's that sort of synergy that's going on in the process. And the characters surprise me. I mean, Annie Delamere, for example, one of the issues with her is that she has a mother who's an ex senior police officer, deputy.
Great character.
Yeah, she's very fun to write. She's and who's sort of retired now, but has sort of reinvented herself as a sort of TV sort of pundit and sort of mouth on a stick, as it were, sort of going.
Well, she's the nightmare mother, especially if you were somebody who tried to maintain some professional integrity and were trying to keep a low profile. And a mother that's constantly cropping up in the media to talk about the policing is not really too helpful for Annie. And it's great fun, not so much for her, but for readers, I think. Yeah,
and that's just one of those things that kind of emerged as I got to know Annie. I thought, oh, that's who her mother's going to be, and that just comes from nowhere, really, in a way,
You have mentioned as well, Alex, that you have written obviously female characters before. Do you find it's difficult to approach that, or does it really not matter so much to you? I mean, I think it's a good question to ask, because I think that so often you would expect that people would naturally be inclined to write characters that they can identify with, but that's certainly not the case. In some genres, people are writing characters that are completely different to anything they've experienced, and I think that that's can make for some really fascinating insights and character developments. Do you personally find that a point of difference, or is it all the same and it's about their traits rather than their gender?
It's about the traits rather than anything else. I enjoy writing. I mean, I certainly enjoy writing Annie Delamere as a character, and I enjoy writing the female characters in the other books. I think and I think very often there's a sort of a spark and aliveness there that's sometimes harder to achieve with the male characters. I think sometimes, because I think it's. I mean, in another of my series, I've got a male character who's a sort of central character, but who's very much kind of hemmed in on both sides by both his superior and his junior, in terms of who sort of keep him on the straight and narrow, or at least try to. So that sort of interaction, I think, is fun to write. And it's and I think with Annie Delamere, I think it's sort of interesting, the relationship between her and her boss, who's male and who is sort of treading slightly warily around, or they're treading slightly warily around each other, because they only recently started working together. And I think that sort of thing's quite interesting to write about as well. So, yeah, I mean, I enjoy, whether I get it right is for others to judge, I think. But I enjoy doing it. It's sort of nice to bring the changes, I think.
Absolutely, and I do think that certainly my experience of crime fiction more recently has been that the insight into a character's own background, or their domestic setup, or relationships beyond their frame of work, or the crimes they investigate, is, again, it adds a huge amount of depth, and is something that brings readers back for more and more as they feel they get to know people, and I can watch a character develop across several books. I do think that that's something that's particularly enjoyable and is another skill in itself. And I just wondered if I could loop back around just for, I think we're getting close to the end of our time to chat before we go over for questions, but I was just going to ask you if you could just offer any thoughts on, you've mentioned that you started off being published by Quercus, who are probably at that time a small independent publisher, and obviously you're now working with Canelo, who are a very small independent publisher. But obviously the industry has changed a huge amount. Ebooks, for example, were probably nowhere near as large in the frame as in, I think 2007 was maybe your first year of publication. That's obviously changed. We're now dealing with a pandemic. What have been the biggest changes, and do you think they're changing for the better? Please say yes.
Yes, I definitely do. I think what's interesting to me is that I mean, as you say, Quercus, when I signed with them, we're a small independent, but we're still operating in a very traditional kind of way. As you say, ebooks weren't really on the scene at that stage. In fact, I think my first contract didn't even mention ebooks at all. That came along a bit later on, I think. I suppose my sense at the time was that it felt a very slow-moving industry. I mean, probably for very good reasons. But it felt as if everything happened at timescales are very long, very, very slow, and from the writer's perspective, that can be quite frustrating. I think you sort of. Whereas I think now, what struck me about sort of smaller independent companies now, particularly, I think some of the majors are still struggling to catch up a bit with this, is you are very agile. That you turn things around very quickly. You're very responsive. You don't get these kind of long silences that I think you used to get. I used to find in back in the day, as it were. So I think there is that sort of speed and agility and so on, which I think is a really good thing. It means that it's good from the writer's perspective. I guess it's also very good from the publisher's perspective. And I think just ebooks is, I think the other thing with crime fiction is that a lot of people who buy crime fiction, they want to buy a book, read it, and then move on, as it were. They don't necessarily want to buy a big artifact that they're going to stick on the shelf for months, which is why charity shops are full of crime novels, I guess. That's not bad, people, and so I think what I've found is there are people out there who are really, really voracious readers, who are just reading book after book after book, and if they become a fan of your series, they're desperate for the next book in the series, and it's. That's the way it works. And I think that's a market which I think has not been traditionally tapped into quite as much as it could have been.
Yeah, well, that's really great to hear. I'm glad that my email response time is not considered glacial, which I often worry about. So that's good to know. Thank you so much, Alex. It's so interesting to hear, even though we've worked together on 2 books now, to hear more about how you actually sit down and get to grips with them. And I believe that perhaps Shirin was going to open up for some conversations. Is that right?
Yes, so we actually have some questions already submitted to us, so I'm going to go through some of those. These are a mixture from the audience. I'm going to read them out and not name any names and embarrass anybody. The first one for Alex would be, who would you cast as Annie in a TV series?
Oh, I'm hoping, because I don't know enough actors and actresses to be able to say. It's my wife's very good at this. I'd have to ask her to
Can I give my answer on that one?
Yeah, please do.
I have always thought, I thought that I like Anna Friel. I thought she would be really good. I saw her in Marcella a couple of years ago, and she's really good at doing the quite gritty, but still, with a bit of warmth and occasionally a bit reckless, which I think is really important in a great female detective character. So that would be my vote.
That's good. That's good enough for me.
We'll send this recording to her afterwards and get her on board. Don't worry.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, another one for Alex. What true life crime has most inspired you in your writing?
That's interesting. I suppose there are 2 or 3 answers to that. I think one is that I've actually incorporated some real life crimes into books at various points, usually by transposing them to somewhere completely different. So the opening of one of my Mongolian books, for example, starts with a murder which was actually based on a sort of gangland murder in Stockport, would you believe, many years ago. And I just took what had happened and then just transposed it into this very different sort of environment and so on. So I hope that, in a way, by doing that, it wasn't being sort of insensitive, I suppose, to the individuals involved. I suppose the other sort of crimes that fascinate me are, and this is a bit of a recurrent theme in a number of my books, is sort of people who go missing in a very sort of almost unobtrusive kind of way. So I've got a number of books where characters are almost sort of fallen off the grid and almost not being missed, and that's an area that sort of fascinates me a lot in terms of the sort of people who are don't have close friends, don't have immediate families, and so on, and who can just really be almost disappeared, without anybody realising what's happened to them. And that's been a sort of slightly recurrent theme in a number of books that I've written. I suppose the other one that fascinated me, just because it was very close to hand when I was living there, was Harold Shipman. Because I lived in a place called Marple, which is just down the road really from Hyde, and we knew Hyde very well. And that was another case that fascinated me, just because it was, almost a kind of respectable serial killer in a strange sort of way, and I knew people who had relatives who were his patients and so on. I knew somebody quite well whose father had actually died, and had died sort of prematurely, as it were. And I remember the chap saying to me, I just don't want to know really, because he died earlier than expected. It may just have been natural causes, but it may have been something that was connected with the wider case. It was never one of the official victims, and that again is it's that sort of thing that fascinates me, where crimes are happening in very almost kind of mundane sort of environments and mundane sort of settings.
could just see everybody's face with the going, ooh, when you mentioned about the the person.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very disturbing moment, you know.
Gosh. Oh, yes, that sounds one. We actually have a question for you, Louise, from the audience, which is, can we ask about your thoughts on what works for publishers? Is it a crime series where readers get hooked on books about the same detective, or are one-off psychological thrillers becoming more popular?
So, really good question. And I'm in my role, I actually work on both. I currently work exclusively sort of with crime fiction authors on edits and things like that. I work with a team and have authors who I've worked with and continue to work with who publish psychological thrillers, and I am a huge fan of the genre as well. I think that Canelo's model is very much a sort of what we call commercial fiction model, and that's largely about sort of relatively fast volume and mass market readership. So whether that be through a reasonably priced ebook or paperback, and trying to make books as accessible to get as many readers as possible for the books, that's the approach that we take. I think that lends itself really well to both psychological thriller and crime series. And as Alex mentioned earlier, I think that for crime series, character is really important to, I would say, to sustain a series, and that development is what draws readers in and keeps them coming back, because I do believe that obviously the crimes are important too, but I think that if you can develop interest in the character, that would mean that there'll be almost a cliffhanger with them and their personal setup, and trying to establish whether they'll evolve and learn the mistakes or they'll keep making the same mistakes in the next book. And it just, if you can connect with that character, it's really important. But then for psychological thrillers, I think that that brilliant concept and that playing on fears that we all may have, often in our domestic sphere, and things that we don't really name or know that we're scared of until they're put in front of us. I think those concepts can just be so brilliant and capture people's imagination. So it is difficult. I think that when we think of the books that have become huge and almost gone beyond publishing, I think more recently it's felt like psychological thrillers done that. But I would say for sort of longevity and growing a readership that will come along with you, crime lends itself to that very well. So I hope that's a good answer.
And following on from that, Louise, would you say that when you're looking for your new titles, is there a different approach for an ebook versus a physical print book?
Not from Canelo's perspective, no. I mean, there are some practical points, I suppose. The length of the book can be one, just a small sort of detail, and that may be that, oh, am I still here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I went very quiet and I thought I'd lost connection. I'm sorry. I think that for a practical point of view, a novel length for us generally means somewhere between around 80 and 100,000 words for the genres that we publish into. I do have colleagues who work on different genres that may mean slightly different. So I think that for us, that's just a sort of practical note that is worth bearing in mind for both ebooks and print books. I think to have a novel of 150 or 175,000 words is much harder to make a paperback of. But if you have that many words, go for it. But it's a practical consideration for us. In terms of our approach, as I've said, like Canelo are very much about commercial fiction, and we place a lot of importance on what we'd say is the package and then the hook. So the package would often just refer to the cover. So a really eye-catching cover is super important. Something that would work on a small thumbnail size is really crucial if you're looking at ebook publication. But we wouldn't really seek to make big changes between an ebook and a print edition. They would tend to be small tweaks, perhaps in terms of what text is on the cover, whether that be quotes or endorsements or similar things, but largely they would be the same. So they do have to work in both formats to get a consistent look for the book and the author and the brand.
Interesting. Thank you, Louise. Alex, we have another question from the audience for you. How rough are your first drafts? Are they really sketchy or more like a work in progress? Or is it something you could show to a reader immediately when you're working on a new title?
I tend to produce a reasonably polished first draft, actually, in some ways surprisingly, surprise myself with it. But I think because the way I tend to write, I don't, for example, leave big gaps in the story, or leave sections unfinished. I tend to write from the beginning until I get to the end, essentially, and there may well be things that I move around at the end, and so on and so forth. But essentially, that's what I do. And so the first draft actually is usually fairly polished, and I tend to sort of write. I tend to edit as I go to some extent. So if the plot develops in a way that means I have to change something earlier on, I will tend to go back and change that at that stage generally, unless it requires something fairly major, rather than just sort of carrying on writing. But by and large, yeah, I mean the first draft is usually longer than the final draft by some distance. Actually, one of the things I do a lot of in editing is just cutting stuff out, because I find that my first draft, usually there's stuff in there that I've written for myself rather than necessarily for the reader. So very often I'll give more information about the characters, for example. And that's partly because I'm learning who the characters are, and that might include actually including scenes that I don't ultimately include, because it's a scene that's useful to me to get to know the character, but actually that it doesn't really add to the story in itself. So I'll take that out, and also just sort of basic things like how people move around a room, or that sort of thing, where in some ways what I'm doing is writing myself to make sure the scene works, and then once I've done that I can afford to lose some of that.
And have you always been that way with your writing?
Pretty much, yes. Yeah. It's yeah. I know there are writers. I know. Ian Rankin, I believe, sort of writes a very rough first draft where he'll sort of leave lots of stuff out, and he just gets the story down and gets the story finished, and then we'll go back and add into it and so on. And that that doesn't quite work for me. I prefer to have something which is fairly polished.
So can I ask a question, Alex? Sorry, Shirin, I've unmuted
go ahead.
myself, because I've just got this quote here from Clive, who's a bit pompous, frankly, isn't he? I think he is a bit pompous. And he said he was having a day off and trying to write something. He said, just get something down. Today, even that approach wasn't working. He couldn't manage to make his thoughts cohere into anything even half sensible. But it didn't matter. He just had to get something down, good or not. So you're not Clive. You're definitely not pompous.
I'm not Clive at all. I think, although I think that process of, if you are stuck carrying on writing, I think so sometimes help, because sometimes your subconscious will carry you through into things in a way that your conscious mind isn't necessarily capable of. So I do find sometimes I just carry it, even if I don't know where I'm going, I'll carry on writing and see where that takes me, So there's that similarity, but I think that's where it ends, really.
Thank goodness.
I don't believe in conspiracy theories either, in the same way that Clive did.
I was going to go there, but I didn't want to do any plot spoiling or anything. So. Thank you. I'll mute myself now.
That's all right, you're allowed. I think we've all read a novel here or there where we think that scene wasn't needed. So it's really interesting, Alex, that you go back and take those out because you've written them for yourself, but not for the audience. It's a really interesting way of describing it. We have another question for Louise, if that's okay. Would you be able to say if there are any basic problems that debut authors fall into in terms of making their books sellable, as Alex mentioned with his first novel? And do you have any advice on what to avoid? Oh,
that's quite a big question. I suppose it can depend on what approach you're taking. So if I understand that the person who's asking the questions may be thinking about how can I get a publisher to be interested, or an agent perhaps to be interested, I think that's one thing. Then perhaps how readers become interested in the novel is perhaps a slightly different and joint effort if you are working with a publisher. And I would say that it's really, from my perspective, it's really important to know that an author sort of understands what they've written, and if they have genres or authors that they admire and would like to be aligned to and like to think that their work is like, it's important that they can sort of explain why they see their books are like that. Also, on the flip side of that, maybe do keep an open mind, because you might think that you've written an absolutely brilliant crime novel, and if you were to engage with an editor or an agent who said, you've got some great material here, but this is a psychological thriller, take that police character into the background, put this brilliant concept in the front and off you go, then I would say try and keep an open mind. But then again, I suppose you do have to be true to your vision for your work as well. The things that debut writers may be more likely to do, that's the difficult one. I mean, I think some debut novelists, maybe they've written 10 different versions that will remain locked in a bottom drawer, but I am fortunate that I see very many very well polished and well done novels. I think that some of the things even that Alex has mentioned, actually just being a bit aware of what's, I suppose, staging and not really moving the story along can perhaps be a little bit, it can reduce the sense of pace in a novel. And I would also say avoid what, from the books that I enjoy working on, too much, I guess, throat clearing is perhaps a way to describe it, where you do a lot of work to introduce the character or the setting or establish things that may happen, and it takes 5 or 6 chapters to get to any real action or events. I like things to happen. My preference is a crime on the first page if it's a crime book. A dead body on the first page is even better, but first page, first chapter, but early in the novel, I think get to the action quite quickly is important if you're looking at commercial fiction publishing.
But then don't take too long to give you any other detail, I think.
Yes.
Don't wake you up too early. I have a question here for both of you, actually. Who is your favourite crime author or your favourite character from crime fiction, if you can't pick an author?
That's really hard. Alex, I'm going to make you go first.
My favourite crime author, I always say this without any hesitation, is Reginald Hill, who wrote the Pascal and Diel books. And all I'd say is, if you haven't read his books, you may have seen, you may remember the TV series with Warren Clark playing Diel. But if you haven't read the books, do, because they're just brilliantly plotted. He writes beautifully. The characters are superb. Diel is still one of the best sort of police characters that I've come across. Wonderfully sort of rude and objectionable in almost every way, but also kind of brilliant in terms of what he does. And there are some, the best books in the series are absolutely superb. I don't think anybody, sort of On Beulah Heights and The Wood Beyond and a few others are just among the best crime novels I've read, I think. So that would be my vote. I suppose also, in a way, more recently, Mick Herron's books, his Slough House books, which, and it's quite clear in that Jackson Lamb, the main character in those, is very much a sort of homage to Diel, I think, as a character. So there's a similar sort of feel to those books, I think, as well.
I do find it really hard to pick a favourite, but I haven't had a minute or two to think about it. It was helpful. I would say probably Val McDermid is one of my all-time favourites. I admire her so much, and I think that the way that her characters develop is something that I think is just, incredibly skillful. And also some of the crimes in the novels still give me a cold chill down my spine when I think of them. I think Tony Hill's character and the dynamic in that series is just really enjoyable, and books that I think I've read a long time ago. Unfortunately, in my line of work, I don't often get to choose the things that I read because I'm so frequently looking at manuscripts that I'm either working on or hoping to publish, which is lovely, but means I don't get a huge amount of time to read the books that are being published elsewhere. So I often listen to audiobooks to try and get around that, and that's been a good way to keep my hand in, but it's nowhere near as many books as I'd love to read if I had all the time in the world to do it.
You get to read things, Louise, that some of us don't get to read either. So
I know,
6
I'm
of one and half a
privileged,
dozen of the other.
I know.
Well, I think that takes us up to our time. So wanted to say a very big thank you to you, Louise, and to you, Alex, for your time today. For the audience, if anybody has any other questions or anything else they think of, please do just send an email into the Groucho. They'll forward it on to us and we can share it with Alex and Louise and get some answers.
Absolutely.
We also wanted to flag that we have our next book club, obviously, in October, details of which will be coming around soon from the Groucho, so please do look out for those. And a wonderful thank you to all of you. That was such an interesting talk. I've learned so much about writing crime fiction. So look out for my book, Louise. It'll be coming to you.
Thank you. I've always got space for more great books. I'm always excited to read new things. So yeah, keep them coming. Don't stop writing. Keep them coming. We need more books.
Great.
I'm unmuting.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your evening.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.